Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. As mentioned, I'm Mirko Bibic. I'm Senior Vice President of Regulatory and Government Affairs at Bell Canada. To my left is David Kidd of Blake Castles in Graydon, and to my right is Ruby Barber, Assistant General Counsel, Bell Canada. Before I dive into my presentation, Mr. Chairman, it's pretty obvious that Globalive has been amending some of its provisions on the fly, and more will be revealed tomorrow, I suspect. And it makes it difficult for all of us to comment on the fly. These are complex provisions, and this is a Type 4 proceeding. So what I would like to do is respectfully ask for an opportunity to speak to the amendments rather than in writing as contemplated in the procedure in an oral continuation of this oral hearing. So I leave that with you, but that would be a preliminary request.
Let's stay on that for a second, because we were just discussing that among ourselves. That's obviously an issue of concern. It's clear after this morning that there will be some amended document filed tomorrow. And also, I get your point. You want to presumably just see the redacted version of the in-camera session, so before you reply, because from it, while you may not get the confidential information, you can certainly get some further submission, etc. So, will it make sense that rather than doing this, we here do the in-camera tomorrow, we adjourn for a week and proceed with the public third phase a week from now, which would give you an opportunity to study the documents that will be filed tomorrow, us too, and will also give us the time to put out the redacted record so that you can look at it.
That would work. That would give us time to consider the new documents and in reply address anything we wanted to address orally. That would work. Thank you.
Okay, so if the other three parties are in agreement, I would propose we do that, so that we meet next Thursday morning at 9 o'clock and do what I call the third phase in my introduction, because I think out of fairness to everybody, we should have all the documents available before us, before we hear the rebuttals by the interveners and the final presentation by Globalive.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I'm not sure.
Mike.
Hank, can you take a mic? Come to the front.
It doesn't make a difference. Wednesday, yeah. Yeah, what's today, Wednesday? Yeah, okay, it's Wednesday, yes, sir. Mr. Intern?
Sorry, I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I'll join my friends Bell Canada here. I only have a few comments, Mr. Chairman. It's obviously your process, but I have two questions. The first is that Globalive was very pleased to see the Commission's commitment that it would be issuing a decision within 30 days of the hearing. Do you see that changing under this process?
I'm a man of my word. You shouldn't have to ask questions.
Thank you. And then secondly, I have to say, just in terms of the expense of the hearing and everything, which is clearly greater on the part of a new entrant, is it really necessary to have, I'm not sure what the magic is in having an oral proceeding. We would be glad if you consider it appropriate to give the incumbents an opportunity to provide their written comments on any additional documents, but is it really necessary to bring everyone back to an oral proceeding?
You should join my staff. They also seem to have a bias for written proceedings. I have a bias for oral proceeding. I want to hear from the people what they do and what they intend to do. So, but my colleague reminded me it's a week from today. Is actually next Wednesday, not next Thursday. So, okay. So let's do it next Wednesday at 9 o'clock then. Okay. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Vivek, proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. BCE was recently the subject of an extensive foreign ownership review by the Commission, culminating in Broadcasting Decision CRTC 2008-69. The BCE decision, with which we have direct experience, is the single most important precedent guiding the Commission's review of Globalive structure, even though it was under the Broadcasting Act. It's your latest significant pronouncement, and most importantly, Globalive relied on it in its filed materials. We appear here today, based on that experience, to offer the Commission a practical perspective on why Globalive structure does not comply with Canada's foreign ownership rules. Indeed, the structure is so fundamentally contrary to the law that the Commission cannot let Globalive commence operations. Our opening statement starts by framing the discussion in terms of the law and policy on Canadian foreign ownership, and then we explain the myriad of practical ways in which Globalive fails to satisfy the law as you must apply. Now, Commissioners, much of what's in this statement has already been discussed, and I suppose that's the difficulty of going last. I'll try to skip over or go quickly on those issues. Some of our perspectives, however, are different, and I will, for those reasons, the fact that much of what we discuss has been said, I'm going to deviate many times from the written text, so I hope you bear with me as I do that. So starting first with some comments on policy and legal context. Globalive invokes Industry Canada's 2008 AWS policy framework as a basis for the Commission to ignore the foreign ownership rules. Globalive urges the Commission to conclude that 1, the AWS auction was designed to facilitate its entry, and 2, that somehow Industry Canada's decision to license Globalive trumps the Commission's jurisdiction to determine foreign ownership compliance under the Telecom Act. These are absurd positions which must be rejected. Globalive's entrepreneurial spirit and ambition and its desire to compete in Canada's wireless space is not the issue. That argument is a smokescreen. We all know, Commissioners, that Section 16 of the Telecom Act is mandatory. We all know that Industry Canada has been clear all along during the AWS policy framework that the CRTC's review process continued to exist. We've outlined all the quotes from the Industry Canada documents in the next couple of pages. I won't propose to go through them. Mr. Chairman, at the beginning of your opening remarks this morning, you indicated that your review under your act is in a different context and a different focus. I will leave it at that. Our formal submissions are in this text, and I'll skip directly to paragraph 10, if you allow me. Our basic point on policy matters is this. If the Commission were to approve Globalive's structure, it would effectively gut the foreign ownership restrictions and signal that foreign investment in some Canadian carriers will be permitted. And Commissioner Menzies, to the question you posed to both TELUS and Rogers, Bell, much like Mr. Engelhardt indicated for Rogers, Bell is prepared to compete with anyone. We're not here about Videotron. We're not here about Shaw. We're not here about Eastlink. But what we do have a problem with is competing against players who get to operate under a different set of rules. This is a serious issue. It's not mere speculation or hearing hyperbole because I happen to have a microphone in front of me. Already, Alpina Holdings has noted on the record of this proceeding that it is seeking debt and equity from a major international telecom operator. It sought to appear here today and to support Globalive in order to have the same flexibility to proceed with its own arrangements. So this will be a precedent. If the Commission were to ignore the law for the sake of competitive entry, as Globalive suggests, the Commission would grant certain carriers the advantage of access to foreign equity markets on terms and conditions potentially more advantageous than those available to other players in domestic markets. So long as the foreign ownership rules remain in place, they must be respected. Now, at this point, I think I'd like to pause to address one of Vice Chairman Katz's questions to TELUS regarding ClearNet. I stepped out during that exchange to ask somebody who's very familiar with ClearNet what happened there. And the short answer is that non-Canadians had very little by way of governance rights in the ClearNet structure and very little capital. In fact, in the early days, Madison Dearborn had 2 of 10 board seats in ClearNet and much, much less than 50% of the capital. For the first few years of ClearNet's existence, what it sought was to build up spectrum positions, and it was founded by the Simmons family, Canadian. Mr. Sirois was an investor, Canadian. There was a private placement with OMERS, again a Canadian. And then at some point later on, MDP, Madison Dearborn, became an investor before it was public. And then in 1994, there was an IPO, which was probably the largest IPO at the time for a telecom startup, and that's when ClearNet became a wireless carrier offering services to consumers. And it's then that Motorola and Nextel became partners in the IPO, but again with very little capital. So I hope that assists in your consideration of how ClearNet is not an appropriate basis of comparison to Globalive. I'm now at paragraph 13 of the opening statement, and it brings me to the central issue in this proceeding, and that's whether Globalive is controlled in fact by Orascom. We say yes. And Mr. Sawiris' testimony this morning about how he intends to use his influence and knowledge establishes this in our view. Let's start first by discussing or examining Globalive's financing. By following the money, the Commission will derive significant insight into who owns and controls Globalive. The source of funds, debt and equity, is the most important factor in this assessment. And our strong submission this afternoon is that the assessment cannot take place in a narrow incremental fashion by just looking at the board composition in isolation or just looking at the vetoes in isolation, etc. One has to take a step back and look at the entire context, the financing and the operations. Decisions have already been made, and those decisions that have already been made have cemented Orascom's control already, and those decisions cannot be undone. I'll address that in a moment, but for now I want to focus on the funds. Orascom, as you've heard, has provided all of the funds, both debt and equity. This is to be contrasted with the BCE case, where none of the investors would have held any debt, and where none of the debt holders would have had any governance rights, such as board seats. Orascom's role also stands in marked contrast with that of Goldman Sachs in the CanWest decision, which Mr. Ryan Fratellis and Rogers already addressed, so I'll skip over that. Those with the most skin in the game will always ensure that their investments are protected. Via the shareholders' agreements, Orascom has secured significant protections and control mechanisms, including a veto over any material contract entered into by Globalive with a value greater than $5 million. And this is important, whether within or outside the ordinary course. And Globalive, of course, also has a veto over expenditures or liabilities greater than $10 million. By way of the debt instruments, Orascom also has additional vetoes which, among other things, restrict Globalive's ability to sell any assets outside the ordinary course of business exceeding 5% of the net asset value. There's also security over all the assets. While one could argue that some of these protections are not unusual for a lender of such magnitude, the fact is that this particular lender is not a bank. Orascom is the major financial and major strategic investor. The structure has been designed to protect Orascom from the very beginning. During the Spectrum auction, Mr. O'Connor, who was an employee of Orascom when the bidding began, was the only designated bidder for Globalive in the auction. You've heard this from Rogers in their earlier testimony. It's evident that Orascom took the lead from the outset, continues to take the lead, and can dominate and determine future decisions. Let's now turn to the debt. Globalive acknowledges that Orascom holds all of Globalive's debt, and I can kind of predict what will happen tomorrow in the in-camera session. Orascom will say, please give us regulatory approval so that we can actually get financing, and don't put a time limit by when we need to get that financing, because then that'll put a gun to our heads vis-a-vis in our negotiations with the financial institutions. I predict that's what will be said tomorrow. And by doing that, Globalive brushes the concerns aside and try to characterize their debt as bridge financing to be replaced with independent third-party financing as soon as possible. But they provided no evidence indicating it has arranged third-party financing or that such financing is imminent. At no time has Orascom indicated that its debt financing is temporary. The Commission cannot grant approval to this structure without third-party financing in place, which is unlikely to happen, it appears. The ownership rules do not grant new entrants grace periods during which they are permitted to be controlled by foreigners to facilitate their entry. To grant such a grace period would be exceptional, would lead to the need for ongoing Commission oversight, and inevitably to requests for extensions. And the longer this goes on, Globalive will have built more of its network, will have hired more employees, will be closer to launch, and the greater the pressure will be not to enforce the rules against them. The time to put a stop to this is now, before Globalive makes further investments and publicly launches its service. What we heard this morning is that there can be no time limit on refinancing. In other words, conditional approval is unacceptable to Globalive. This makes the situation black and white. Either the CRTC blesses the current highly aggressive financial structure with no conditions, or it rejects the structure. In our view, you cannot possibly accept a structure where the non-Canadian holds all the equity, all the debt, and all the expertise. I turn now to the equity. Globalive's equity structure is equally a concern. First, as you know, Orascom has put up all of the cash equity necessary to finance the business. AAL's sole contribution of any significance is its wireline assets, and since both businesses will not be operating as one, as Mr. Lockie conceded this morning, the contribution of the wireline business should not be considered in assessing the relative equity positions of Orascom and AAL. You will recall, Commissioners, in the CanWest decision, in deciding that Goldman Sachs' equity position would not give them control in fact, you considered that CanWest was contributing its properties and would operate them and the acquired Alliance Atlantis properties as one business, thereby allowing CanWest's contribution of assets to count as common equity. Even if you count the value of the wireline business in this case, since AAL's equity investment is fixed at the value of that business, any additional equity will come from Orascom, suggesting that its economic interest will rise over time. Even though Mr. Sawiris has said he would welcome Canadian equity, his customary approach is revealed by examining his comments at an investor conference, which I quote at the top of page 6, where Mr. Sawiris states, his strategy has always been to expand his ownership and not to sell down to others. And then he later says, we would like to keep as much equity as possible because our experience has shown us that we usually regret if we didn't buy minority interests or exclude minority interests from the very beginning. I kind of repeated that today as well. So while Globalive this morning said that the shareholder agreements contemplate more Canadian equity, you revealed in your questioning, Mr. Chairman, that Orascom has a veto over the issuance of new securities, and that Mr. Sawiris wants to keep at least 51% of equity at all times. I may not have a firm grasp of all the agreements, but I don't actually think that AAL has a similar veto right. While Globalive refers to precedent where the Commission approved for an equity investment at the 65% level, we know of no precedent where a non-Canadian provided all the equity and all of the debt and secured significant voting rights. Now, Mr. Infant this morning in his submission argued that the foreign ownership rules don't apply until a business is launched. This is artificial in the extreme. This pretends that pre-launch decisions don't affect actual operations. This is what I'd like to explore now. I'll start first with network and technology. It is apparent that Orascom has control over virtually every key decision that Globalive made in commencing operations and will continue to make in conducting day-to-day business. Mr. Sawiris indicates that one of his conditions to invest was his ability to leverage his industrial advantages without the Canadian partner making life difficult for him. This is one of the reasons he got along so well with Mr. Lacavere, including their entrepreneurial ambition and etc. So let's start with the Globalive technology and network design decisions. They're the foundation of a wireless business. They drive handset selection, network costs and efficiencies, and determine future opportunities for strategic alliances. No decision on these important questions can be made by Globalive without Orascom's approval. First, the TSA effectively allows Orascom to dictate all technology, network, and other operational decisions. Notably, unlike the advisory services agreement in the BCE case, the scope of Orascom's advice is all-encompassing. Globalive's claim that its arrangement with Nokia Siemens Networks somehow proves that the TSA is not all-encompassing lacks merit. The fact that Globalive has this arrangement proves only one thing. Orascom is satisfied with the selection of Nokia Siemens Networks. In any event, the board and management of the operating carrier will not be in a position to ever reject Orascom's technical advice. First, Orascom has the expertise. Second, it appears that Globalive is paying significant fees for this advice and will thus be motivated to take advantage of it. Let me pause here for a moment and go back to the BCE situation. We would have had that deal gone through, an advisory services agreement with the non-Canadian investors, and you may recall, Commissioners Katz and Mr. Chairman, that we would have been required to pay fees under that agreement in any event, whether advice was given or not. I believe we indicated to you during the hearing that, being quite open, the fact that we had to pay fees regardless, we would take advantage of that advice, absolutely would. The point was that it wasn't all-encompassing, it was related to financial matters, and you imposed a couple of filters to make sure that you were satisfied with the questions of control. So I think the fact that fees are being paid here and there will be the motivation to take advantage of the advice is fairly significant. Third, Orascom's veto over contracts and expenditures ensures that no technology and network decisions can be made without approval, as I said. Consider the following. In a September 11th Globe and Mail article, Mr. Lacavere estimated that Globalive needs 500 to 600 towers to launch service in Toronto and Calgary. We believe that approximately 450 cell sites are required to cover the GTA alone. It can cost between $250,000 and $500,000 per cell site, depending on its location. So that could be up to $225 million for Toronto alone, well above the $5 million veto threshold. So Orascom had a veto over all those bills. All the construction vendors and infrastructure equipment vendors you'd need to build a network would have contracts above the $5 million. That's a veto. Cell sites need to be maintained. That's well over $5 million a year. That's a veto. Domestic backhaul arrangements with terrestrial carriers for globalized wireless traffic will cost more than $5 million. Veto. Outbound roaming agreements will also be greater than $5 million. Veto. Now, one could say let's bump up the threshold to above $5 million. The point is, these decisions, or most of these decisions, have already been made. So, tinkering with the veto by increasing the monetary threshold will not alter the fact that Orascom controlled all these decisions thus far, decisions which have set Globalive irreversibly down its operational path, a path charted by Orascom. Let me now turn to other day-to-day operational decisions that a wireless business needs to deal with. They shed more light on control. Handsets. For an operation like Globalive's, using a conservative average cost of about $200 per handset, the purchase of a mere 25,000 units would trigger a veto. However, Globalive projects 1.5 million customers within 3 years of launch, which means a capital expenditure of at least $300 million by year 3 on handsets. Conservatively assuming that customers will upgrade handsets every 3 years on average, Globalive would spend in excess of $100 million on handsets each year, and even more as its business grows. So unless that veto threshold were bumped up to $100 million, you get a veto. Billing systems, $5 to $10 million. Cost of an enterprise resource planning system would be in the same range, and IT maintenance and support will likely exceed $5 million annually. Orascom controlled every one of these decisions. Since they've already been made, or are likely very imminent, Orascom effectively cemented its control well prior to this commission review. Now let's look at marketing. Having decided on network technology and arranged for handsets, billing systems, and other back-office systems, you need to distribute and market your services to be successful. Consider this. The launch of Orascom's Wind brand nationally could exceed $20 million. To launch the brand in Toronto alone will exceed $5 million. Advertising campaigns for discrete product launches will easily exceed $5 million. Distribution agreements with national retailers such as Best Buy or Glentel could be in excess of $5 million each before a single handset is placed on the shelves. Again, tinkering with the governance arrangements will not change the fact that the brand has been chosen. Advertising programs and distribution arrangements are likely well underway, if not already finalized. They too cannot easily be cast aside. In the case of the brand, this clearly won't be cast aside. We've been told this morning that the trademark license is on favorable terms. Having to rebrand at market costs would be daunting indeed. I now turn to employees who are always critical to the success of any business. And in this case, the CEO of GWMC and potentially others have past ties to Orascom. I would turn the Commissioner's attention to the following points. Orascom has a veto over any remuneration calculated by reference to income or profits, which would capture commission-based sales programs, which no one has pointed out today. Orascom has the ability to veto the issuance of stock options, and there's been a lot of discussion on today, so I won't spend too much time on it. The point in the questions, Mr. Chairman, that you were asking Mr. Campbell is not whether there will be a stock option program. Clearly there will be. That's not what was asked. The question was really around what kind of influence Orascom would have over the managers. And stock option programs have significant influence over managers. So every aspect of Globalive's business and operations to date has been controlled and will continue to be controlled by Orascom. While we have placed emphasis on the vetoes, even if their monetary thresholds were increased to $500 million, Orascom would still significantly influence and control Globalive's decisions with respect to handsets, technology, and networks. Orascom can exercise its influence positively by making decisions or negatively by exercising veto rights or other threats. This allows Orascom to determine strategic decisions, whether within or outside the ordinary course, as well as day-to-day business decisions. In the words of the NTA's seminal Canadian Airlines decision, Orascom is able, on its own volition, to unilaterally determine or decide the strategic decision-making activity of Globalive on an ongoing basis. In fact, the decisions made to date have charted Globalive down a path which cannot be reversed, even if the Commission were to modify the structures at this time. So having discussed operational matters, I'd like to turn now to additional governance issues, starting with board composition. I think where we all should start in looking at the board composition is what the Commission said in BCE. Canadian control involves not only having a majority of Canadians on the board, but ensuring that Canadian investors can exercise effective control through director representation. Globalive's 3 boards fail this standard. Start first with GIHC. You know the facts. It's 2 nominees for Oscom, 2 for AAL, and 3rd independent. AAL obviously can't exercise effective control. Contrast that with BCE situation where Teachers, the Canadian investor, would have had twice as many board seats as the largest non-Canadian investor and more seats than all non-Canadians combined.